Hello everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 1 draft, and we just watched the culminating preseason friendlies. We also saw the Community Shield match, so shout out to FPL Raptor, who we all saw on ITV, if you managed to catch that in the game. On top of that though, I'd like to mention that Fantasy Football Hub still have an offer in place. So they're a great tool to sort of expand your FPL playing toolset. You have the Opta stats, which give you a lot of advanced data in the preseason, as well as also, let's say, going back to previous seasons of data. On top of that too, you have things like the points projections, the suggested transfer tool, even Ben Krillen's FPL calendar, all in one place in the Fantasy Football Hub app. So they have an offer of 50% off up until the end of the Game Week 1 deadline. So if you want to sort of look into that, have a look in the link in the description and join now if you'd like. As far as my Game Week 1 draft, as I said, we saw the preseason games and that has made me change my mind on certain players. And I think the structure in place is very similar to the updated draft around a week ago, and we have some conclusive updates to make. I think my team selection will also be extremely close to this draft because I'm pretty confident in the structure, although I will suggest two options within this draft and you can let me know what your thoughts are between the two. So starting with the defense, I'm still very much high on a Crystal Palace goalkeeper. We got some updated news that Johnstone seems to be eyeing a move away from Crystal Palace, and as I said, it was very clear to me that Henderson would be the #1 starting goalkeeper for this season. I don't think anything has changed. So my goalkeeper pairing is still going to be Henderson and Fabianski. I think Valdemarsson is also a keeper we can go with. Ultimately, there are no 4.0 starting goalkeepers in the game. So it's sort of just looking at some of the backup goalkeepers and finding the one that you like. I don't think there's anything in particular here with me going Fabianski, but it seems like Fabianski has quite often played, at least, you know, as a deputy goalkeeper, more so than any of the other 4.0. So that's just a small little point. As far as Henderson, as I said, I am still eyeing roughly a sort of wildcard 6 strategy. So if you haven't seen my strategy video on the wildcard, feel free to have a look at that. That should show up as part of the exclamation box above. But the reason why I'm on a wildcard 6 is, as I said, I do think that's a major swing for going back into an Arsenal heavy draft and even, you know, trying to capitalize on going for some of the City players ahead of, let's say, Game Week 7, where their fixture swing is definitely conclusively there. On top of that, I think it's also a nice window to drop off some of the Liverpool assets that we start the season off with, and that's pretty much why I've gone with this sort of draft theme. Now, in the defense, I've actually gone with a double up of Liverpool. I think over the preseason, we saw Quansah play. He started the preseason well. Konate has also taken a part into the preseason. He played, however, in the almost B team friendly with Las Palmas, which Robertson did as well, but I'll explain my thoughts on Robertson in a moment. But we saw Quansah play alongside Virgil van Dijk in the game versus Sevilla, where Liverpool were victorious, and Quansah looked once again like the preferred center back, at least as per my expectations. We sort of were thinking about this. If you have been watching the cheat sheet series, you'll know that Quansah has been considered. But I think right now, looking at a lot of the fan sentiment, a lot of what Slot has shown us so far in terms of his hand, I do think that we have enough to say that Quansah can start the season with Liverpool and that it is his spot to lose until a later date. The difference with that with Tsimikas, who also started in the Sevilla game, in my opinion, is that Robertson hasn't featured a single minute at all in the preseason up until the Las Palmas match. And so I think with Tsimikas, it might be the case that his position can be lost very quickly to Robertson, and it's not necessarily his position to lose per se, as it is for Quansah and Konate. So I think there's a small difference there. The reason why I'm going with Liverpool defense, though, is because generally speaking, the Game Week 1 to 5 run is really good for Liverpool. Game Week 3 is the tough fixture, but I don't necessarily need to be playing someone like Quansah in Game Week 3. I will have another 4.5 defender, and you'll see here that I have Quansah here, who I'll also talk about how I think he's interchangeable with Dunk, but the relationship between, let's say, a player like Quansah and Dunk is very much so the key fact that they have good fixtures on Game Weeks 4 and 5. So this applies to both Brighton and Aston Villa. I'm not saying that I think Aston Villa are a better defensive team than Brighton. That's clearly not the case. The reason why I've actually gone for Quansah is because I didn't want to triple up on Brighton so early, and I still wanted to take advantage of the potential opportunity to go for Barco, who I still think will start the season. There is a little bit of fear around Kadioglu joining Brighton because it seems like Brighton have already submitted bids to purchase Kadioglu. But we also know that Barco has been signed for a reason. I think he's also been preferred and played a lot of preseason minutes. Baleba is the only player that the manager so far has identified as being able to play left back during Estupiñán's absence. So even though Kadioglu can come in, I think it's very possible that he can also play the right back role for the team. I don't necessarily see him as just being someone who will just automatically displace Barco from the team. So I do think Barco's spot in the team is relatively secure until Estupiñán is back. And it will take time for Estupiñán to get match fitness, which is why I'm still on Barco. The reason why I don't want to triple up on Brighton, though, is because I'm actually looking into Yankuba Minte as a pick that will definitely sit in my draft, depending on the structure that I finally go with. And I like keeping the option open to be able to go for Minte later down the line. I also see myself definitely either starting the season with someone like João Pedro or picking him up at around game week 4. So we'll look into that in a moment. But yeah, going back to the point on defense, Quansah is definitely a little bit risky, which is why I do need someone like Quansah or Dunk, who I think are two nailed players. You could argue that Pau Torres is the actual nailed player within this Aston Villa team, and I probably wouldn't disagree with you. So I'll definitely be looking into that spot, but it's either Quansah or Dunk right now for me, or once again, another Aston Villa defender like Pau Torres. So seeing that as the starting point, we have the defense in place. And the question, I suppose, is, why still go for Trent and Porro? Why not go for maybe players like Guardiola and Gabriel, who also just scored in a preseason friendly? I think it's actually a good question. And to be fair, Trent and Porro is still a little bit cheaper than the partnership of Gabriel and Guardiola, which is another key point. I needed that 0.5 million cost saving. On top of that, too, I just generally like the fixtures between game weeks 1 and 5 for Liverpool and Tottenham as a pairing up compared to, let's say, Gabriel and Guardiola. And given the draft structure that you'll see later on, it doesn't really allow me, I think, the flexibility to currently go for some players that are a little bit more expensive in the defensive position. So I don't have an extremely deep defense, but I still have two in what I would call premium defenders with Trent and Porro. So I'm looking at, let's say, game week 6 as an opportunity when I finally wildcard to probably look at Gabriel and Guardiola, revisiting whether Guardiola has any X-Mins risks around that time, and then bringing him into my team. As far as the midfield, we're going to go with a lot of key players that you've seen already. And in fact, this midfield, I believe, is exactly the same as you've seen previously, at least in this option 1. So in option 1, we're actually going to go with the players that I mentioned, which is Saka, Nkunku, Eze, Winks, and Bruno Fernandes. Now, the reason why I'm actually going with players like Nkunku, with Bruno, with Eze, and Saka, is I still think that all these players will be nailed to start game week 1. They will be nailed, and they will not really require transfers out. I am still keeping an open mind to players like Palmer, like Foden, even some of the other players in the 5.5 position. So I already talked about Minte. I think Smith Rowe is actually another player that's very interesting. But given that I'm actually going to go quite top heavy into my starting attacking 7, I'm happy and comfortable with going with Winks here, because no one else in the draft that I have right now, in my opinion, is going to lose their position in their teams too soon. And I do really like them as picks. So that's why I've gone right now for players like Saka, Nkunku, Eze, Bruno Fernandes. They all take penalties except for Nkunku. Nkunku, however, I still think is going to be an absolute ace in the hole. In fact, I think betting markets have started to project fantasy points, and you'll see that Nkunku, both for the goal projections and the fantasy point projections, are ridiculous for a 6.5 midfielder, and he's very, very far clear of any of the other 5.5s. Yes, it's not the best thing to see when Chelsea have Dewsbury Hall, Madueke, so many other players in the team that can actually maybe take away from the minutes of Nkunku. But I think the beauty of Nkunku is that his positional flexibility means that he should be able to fill in minutes. And I can't really see him starting off the bench in any of the opening fixtures up until maybe the European fixtures. But even still, I would see that as more of an opportunity to rotate some players and bench the starting 11 for Chelsea, because they're only participating within the European Conference League compared to, let's say, Nkunku and Palmer playing too many more minutes within Europe. So those are my thoughts right now on Nkunku. Yes, there's a little bit of a substitute risk, but I don't see him not starting fixtures of football. As far as the attack, I have actually decided to go on with Muniz, Haaland, and Isak in this structure. Now, this spot with Muniz is definitely a little bit shaky. Previously, I've had Adam Armstrong. I've also considered João Pedro, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I really just like Muniz's fixtures from game weeks 1 to 5. I think the same argument can be held with someone like Smith Rowe, right? I've gone for Winks in this draft, but if you want to go for someone like Ross Stewart, if you want to go for someone like Jebbison, with Bournemouth, you can definitely go for a 5.5 midfielder instead, or even a 6.0 midfielder, although we don't really have many options in the game who are at a 6.0 pricing. So I am definitely considering someone like Muniz right now, because I just want to have a nailed forward. and I don't really want to mess around with having to call upon someone like Winks as an auto sub option unless there's an injury in place. So that's why I've considered in option 1 here to go with Muniz and Winks, and just treat this as a 7 attacker team with minimal rotation, and then having a little bit of a stronger defense where, you know, someone like Konsa or Dunk can fill in case I want to, let's say, bench someone like Porro in game week 4, where I'm also hoping Barco can take a role there where he has Ipswich at home. So those are my thoughts right now. The reason why I want to go with the Haaland structure when we go back to the forwards is because I still think that a Haaland and Salah structure right now to start the season is very tough. I still want to have players like Trent, like Bruno, like Isak within my team, and I'm finding it very hard to do so if I go for Haaland and Salah. So the reason why I've chosen either Haaland only or Salah only within my draft structures is simply because I think it's too tight to do so. But at around game week 4, I would say that Isak's fixtures get a little bit worse, and then we can reconsider moving someone like Isak into a budget forward if we don't go for Watkins. And then we can go for maybe someone like João Pedro, revisit him later down the line in this draft structure, and then maybe move someone like Saka to Salah, because I think Salah is really nice for the game week 5 captaincy as well. We might even actually be looking at some of the early fixtures, and I might even decide against this. I might decide to drop someone like Saka into someone like Diogo Jota. But for now, I'm quite happy with picking nailed players who don't really have too many minutes issues, and that's why we've gone with the front line that we have. And I think in terms of the judgment between Haaland and Salah, so Salah clearly is the better captaincy option in most weeks, but if you have Haaland and Saka, I think you cover the captaincy options better, at least up until game week 5, where the Salah captaincy, I would say, reigns supreme. By doing so, you also capture Haaland versus Ipswich in game week 2, which I just think is such a good fixture. And I think you have a judgmental question in terms of deciding between Haaland and Salah and choosing which player you really want to back. Because right now, I would say I'm a little bit more comfortable backing Haaland in a Haaland-only structure over Salah in a Salah-only structure. And that's pretty much the judgment that I think a lot of managers have to make. The ownership right now between Haaland and Salah is extremely close. And I can see a lot of people staying firmly on one side, and that's totally fine. But those are just my thoughts. So moving on, what is option number 2? Option number 2 actually just has 2 changes. So the 2 changes are actually to replace Winks and to replace Muniz for João Pedro and Morgan Rogers. Rogers has played a lot of preseason minutes, and we just saw João Pedro come back into the team to play 45 minutes in the last match that Brighton just had. He also scored a wonderful goal if you got a chance to see it. But arguably in this draft structure here, what I like about it is that I can spend the additional 0.5 between Muniz and João Pedro's price point and actually get a really, really consistent auto sub option in Morgan Rogers. Another thing about João Pedro is that he will be facing off versus Arsenal in game week 3. So the beauty of going for Rogers is that he still has a good fixture in game week 3, which is Leicester away. And I'd be a lot more comfortable benching João Pedro versus Arsenal and then going with Rogers versus Leicester at around that time, so long as Rogers' spot within the team is still relatively secure, which I think it is, but it is fragile as well because there are a lot of depth, and our Aston Villa have also made a lot of transfer signings as well, which will definitely impact Rogers' minutes later down the line. So that's option number 2. Once again, it carries a better auto sub option in Rogers. It allows for a little bit of rotation on game week 3. And then we still keep João Pedro for what is a great run of games after game week 3. Game weeks 4 and 5 in particular are really good Brighton games, and then I'd be wildcarding. So that is something that I'm thinking about. But generally speaking, these are the 2 structures that I'm messing around with. I'm pretty close to both options. I like having an auto sub option. You guys know I always do. I have considered players like Oscar Bob as well, but I think that the one risk I would say in quotation marks right now with my draft is very clearly Quansah. And I don't want to carry 2 major risks within my draft because with Quansah, at least I have an auto sub defensive option in someone like Dunk or Konsa within the structure. If I was to, let's say, go with Bob, he'd be my 8th attacker. So I would be really needing João Pedro to play consistent games. But then I also can't use Bob to, let's say, cover the game week 3 bad fixture for João Pedro, which is, even though, let's say, the Ipswich fixture is amazing for Oscar Bob, and if he starts that, then I'll probably be regretting not going for Bob. That's the issue that I think we have to deal with as someone who might be considering Bob as a little bit of a sort of pick to deal with in the draft structures that we have currently. So this is my current updated draft. I'm very happy with it as it stands. I can't see too many changes happening unless I suddenly feel a lot of doubt over, let's say, the Quansah position in the draft, or maybe something, leans me to moving to, let's say, a 5.5 midfielder instead. or a 6.0 midfielder, and then starting with the 4.5 forward. Right now, I think Smith Rowe, Minte, Ben Brereton, Diaz, even Semenyo are the interesting 5.5 options. But I still prefer going for a 5.5 or a 6.0 forward to start the season. And that's why I'm on this draft structure. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'll see you guys soon. And do look out for more cheat sheet content as well. And do visit Fantasy Football Hub as well if you want to have a look at the offer that they have in place, which expires on Game Week 1. The link is in the description below. Thank you, take care, and goodbye.